The dust hung heavy in the autumn air of 1876 as Penelope Norwood stepped down from the stagecoach, her once fine boots now scuffed from the journey west. At 35, the lines around her eyes told stories of a woman who had lived through enough heartbreak for 2 lifetimes. Beaver, Colorado Territory, had not been her destination of choice, merely the last stop on a road that began with her husband's funeral back in Boston, and continued through a series of increasingly desperate letters from her ailing father. The small mining town sprawled before her, its wooden buildings weathered by mountain winds and harsh winters. A single thoroughfare cut through the center, lined with establishments that catered to miners, cattlemen, and the occasional traveler. Penelope clutched her carpetbag with white knuckles, trying to ignore the curious stares from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing a woman of her bearing arrive alone. "Mrs. Norwood," a reedy voice called from the boardwalk. A thin man in spectacles hurried toward her, his vest buttoned incorrectly in his apparent haste. "I'm Elias Humphrey, your father's solicitor." "Where is he?" Penelope asked, her voice tight with worry. His last letter was nearly unintelligible. Elias removed his hat, a gesture that sent a cold dread through her. "I'm afraid he passed 3 days ago, madam. The consumption took him rather quickly at the end." Penelope closed her eyes briefly. Too late. Always too late. She had traveled across half the continent, only to miss her father's final moments. The weight of this new loss settled over her like another layer of dust on her travel-worn clothes. "He left you everything, of course," Elias continued, clearly uncomfortable with her silence. "The house at the edge of town and the claim, though I'm afraid neither is worth what it once was." "I see." She didn't, not really, but what was there to understand? She had come to care for a dying man and instead inherited his failures. "Please take me to the house, Mr. Humphrey." The house proved to be little more than a cabin on a barren plot of land overlooking the town. Inside, she found a sparse collection of furniture, her father's mining equipment, and the lingering smell of illness. Elias excused himself quickly after showing her the deed papers, promising to return the next day to discuss her options. Alone, Penelope sat on the edge of her father's bed and finally allowed herself to weep not just for him, but for the life she had once envisioned for herself. A husband now buried in Massachusetts soil, no children to comfort her, and now her father gone too, leaving her with nothing but a dilapidated cabin and a worthless mining claim in a town where she knew no one. As twilight settled over the mountains, Penelope stood at the cabin's single window, watching the lights of Beaver twinkle to life. Tomorrow, she would need to make decisions. Tonight, she would mourn. The following morning brought no relief from her grief, but it did bring clarity. She needed to sell whatever her father had left her and return east as quickly as possible. Perhaps her sister-in-law would still welcome her into her Boston home. The thought held little appeal, but it was preferable to remaining in this dusty corner of nowhere. Penelope dressed in her second-best dress black, still in mourning for her husband, and made her way down the hillside path toward town. The solicitor's office sat between the general store and what appeared to be a reasonably respectable hotel. "Mrs. Norwood," Elias greeted her, seeming surprised to see her so early. "I was just preparing to bring you these." He gestured to a stack of papers on his desk. "I've made my decision, Mr. Humphrey. I wish to sell everything and return east as soon as possible." Elias's expression fell. "I'm afraid that won't be as simple as you might hope. Your father's debts exceed the value of his property and the claim. Well, most folks believe it's played out." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, Mrs. Norwood, that if you sell now, you'll likely leave Beaver with nothing but the clothes on your back. Perhaps less once the creditors take their due. The room seemed to tilt. That's impossible. My father wrote that he was making a good living. Your father was an optimistic man until the end, Elias said gently. He didn't want to worry you. Penelope sat heavily in the chair opposite his desk. What am I to do then? Work the claim, hire someone who knows mining, or— He hesitated. The hotel is looking for help. Respectable work for a widow. The very idea made her stomach clench. She, who had once hosted dinner parties for Boston's elite, serving rooms at a frontier hotel. I need time to think, she said finally, rising from the chair. Of course. But the creditors won't wait forever. She left the solicitor's office with her head spinning. The town around her seemed hostile now, a trap rather than a refuge. She walked blindly, barely noticing her surroundings until she found herself outside a building with a Sayers office painted above the door. Without fully understanding why, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Perhaps she needed to know exactly how worthless her father's claim truly was. The interior was cool and dim after the bright mountain sunlight. Glass cabinets lined one wall, displaying rock specimens. A man stood at a workbench with his back to her, broad-shouldered and tall, his stance speaking of strength honed by physical labor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. The man turned, and Penelope found herself looking into the bluest eyes she had ever seen, set in a weathered face topped with sandy hair. Not young, certainly past 40, with lines etched deeply around his eyes and mouth. He was dressed simply in a flannel shirt and canvas trousers, with none of the flamboyance some Western men seem to favor. "Can I help you, madam?" His voice was deep, with a slight southern drawl that identified him as not being native to these mountains. "I'm Penelope Norwood." Howard Norwood's daughter. I have some questions about my father's claim. Recognition flashed in those blue eyes. "Keith Young," he introduced himself with a slight nod. "I knew your father. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you." The words were automatic, hollow from repetition. "Mr. Humphrey tells me the claim is worthless." Keith Young wiped his hands on a rag and gestured toward a chair. "Not entirely accurate. Your father found color regularly enough to keep going, just not enough to pay his debts. Could someone with knowledge make it profitable?" He studied her for a moment. "Maybe, with luck and hard work. Your father was no fool when it came to mining, Mrs. Norwood. If he believed there was something worth finding up there, he might have been right." Hope fluttered weakly in her chest. "Would you be willing to look at it?" "I would compensate you for your time." A faint smile touched his lips. "I don't need payment for a few hours' work. I can ride up tomorrow if that suits." "It does. Thank you, Mr. Young." As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Mrs. Norwood, don't give up on that claim just yet." Howard was convinced there was a vein he hadn't found, called it his dream. The word struck her like a physical blow. Dreams. She had long ago stopped believing in those. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Penelope had spent a restless night in her father's cabin, alternating between grief and anxiety about her future. She had risen early to tidy the place as best she could, though there was little she could do about the sparse furnishings or worn floorboards. A knock at the door announced Keith Young's arrival. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking even taller than she remembered. Beside him was a dappled gray horse, saddled and patient. "Good morning, Mrs. Norwood." "Good morning, Mr. Young. Please come in." He ducked slightly to enter the low doorway, his presence immediately filling the small cabin. Penelope was acutely aware of her simple dress and hastily pinned hair. "I've brought the maps your father filed with the assayer's office," he said, pulling folded papers from his saddlebag. "Thought we might compare them to what's actually up there." They spread the maps on the table, and Keith pointed out the boundaries of the claim, explaining the markings that indicated where her father had already dug. He was systematic, Keith noted, working his way along this ridge, following what he believed was a vein running northeast. And you think there might be something to find? Keith met her gaze directly. I think your father wasn't a fool or a dreamer, despite what some folks in town might say. He knew these mountains better than most. The words gave her a strange comfort. Shall we go look? He seemed surprised. You want to come along? It's my claim, is it not? I should see it. Keith studied her for a moment, then nodded. We'll need to ride. Do you have a horse? My father's is in the lean-to. I haven't ridden in years, but I assume it's like remembering how to swim. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Something like that. I'll saddle him for you. An hour later, they were climbing a narrow trail that wound up the mountainside behind the cabin. Penelope's muscles protested the unfamiliar activity, but she was determined not to show weakness. Keith rode ahead, occasionally glancing back to check on her progress. The claim itself was marked by a crude wooden sign bearing her father's name. Beyond it, the mountainside had been carved with several tunnel entrances, piles of tailings marking each one. A small shed stood nearby, containing tools and a crude ore cart on iron rails that disappeared into the largest tunnel. Keith dismounted and tied his horse to a stunted pine. Your father was organized. That's good. He gestured toward the tunnels. He numbered them. We'll start with the most recent, that would be number 4, according to his notes. Penelope climbed down from her father's horse, wincing at the stiffness in her legs. What are we looking for exactly? Keith lit a lantern he'd taken from his saddlebag. Signs that he was on the right track, traces of ore that might indicate a larger deposit. They entered the tunnel, Keith leading the way with the lantern held high. The air inside was cool and damp, smelling of earth and something metallic. The ceiling was low enough that Keith had to stoop slightly. Your father was following this quartz vein, he explained, pointing to a whitish streak in the rock wall. Quartz often carries gold. See these darker flecks? That's what he was after. Penelope peered at the wall, seeing nothing remarkable in the stone. And is there enough to make it worthwhile? That's what we need to determine. He moved deeper into the tunnel, examining the walls carefully. He was still actively working this one when he fell ill. Look here, his last blast. The tunnel ended in a rough face of rock, with drill marks visible in the stone. Keith ran his hand over the surface, then knelt to examine something more closely. Mrs. Norwood, he said quietly, come look at this. She joined him, kneeling awkwardly in her skirts. In the lantern light, she could see tiny yellow flecks embedded in the quartz. Is that gold? Keith confirmed. And not just trace amounts, this is high-grade ore. He stood, shining the lantern along the vein that disappeared into the rock face. Your father was right. There's a vein here, and from the looks of it, a rich one. Penelope stared at the glinting specks, trying to understand what this meant. So the claim is valuable after all, potentially very valuable. But he turned to face her, mining it won't be easy. You'll need capital for equipment, workers, and even then there's always risk. I have no capital, Mr. Young, only debts. He was silent for a moment, considering. There are investors in town who might front the money for a percentage of the profits. But they're sharks, Mrs. Norwood. They'd leave you with crumbs. What choice do I have? Keith's blue eyes reflected the lantern light. You could sell to me. The statement caught her off guard. I've saved over the years. Not enough to develop the mine properly, but enough to pay off your father's debts and give you a fair price for the claim. You could return east with something to show for your journey. Penelope studied his face, searching for signs of deception. Why would you make such an offer? Because I believe your father was right, and because, He hesitated, then continued more quietly, because I owe him. He stood by me when others didn't. There was clearly a story there, but Penelope was too overwhelmed to ask for details. I need time to consider. Of course. He nodded, extinguishing the lantern as they emerged from the tunnel into the bright mountain sunlight. It's not a decision to make hastily. As they rode back down to the cabin, Penelope's mind whirled with possibilities. The claim was valuable, potentially her salvation. But did she have the courage or the means to see it through? And could she trust this man, this stranger with the steady gaze and quiet voice? Back at the cabin, Keith helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Thank you for your help today, Mr. Young," she said, stepping back quickly. "Keith, please." He adjusted his hat. "Think about my offer. I'll call on you in a few days for your answer." As she watched him ride away, Penelope felt a curious mixture of hope and apprehension. For the first time since arriving in Beaver, she had options, but they all required trusting in things she had long since stopped believing in. Luck, fortune, and the goodness of a stranger. The next morning, Penelope walked into town with a newfound purpose. She needed information about Keith Young before she could consider his offer. The general store seemed the logical place to start in her experience. Shopkeepers knew everyone's business. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. The store was well stocked for a frontier town, with goods ranging from foodstuffs to clothing to mining supplies. A round-faced woman with graying hair stood behind the counter, watching Penelope with undisguised curiosity. "Good morning," the woman called. "You must be Howard's daughter." "I'm Martha Williams. My husband and I run the place." "Penelope Norwood." "Yes, I arrived recently." "Such a shame about your father. He was well liked." Martha's expression was genuinely sympathetic. "What can I help you with today?" Penelope pretended to examine a display of canned goods. "Actually, I was hoping you might tell me about Keith Young. He's offered to purchase my father's claim, and I know very little about him." Martha's eyebrows rose. "Keith offered to buy the claim. Well, that's interesting." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "He's a good man, Mrs. Norwood. Came here about 5 years ago from Virginia. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair in his dealings. Runs the assayer's office honest, which is more than can be said for some. My father knew him well. Oh yes, they were friendly. Your father helped Keith when he first arrived, gave him work when others were wary of a Southerner so soon after the war." Martha folded her arms. "If Keith's offering to buy that claim, I'd take it as a compliment. He doesn't make foolish investments." Penelope nodded, digesting this information. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams. That's helpful. You planning to stay in Beaver long?" The question caught Penelope off guard. I'm not certain yet." Martha smiled knowingly. "Well, we could use another good woman around here. Too many men and not enough civilizing influence, if you ask me." Penelope made a few small purchases, tea, sugar, and a loaf of bread before heading back out onto the street. As she passed the hotel, she noticed Keith emerging from the building, deep in conversation with a well-dressed man she hadn't seen before. Keith spotted her and excused himself from his companion, crossing the street to meet her. "Mrs. Norwood, out for supplies?" "Yes," she nodded toward the retreating figure. "A friend of yours, business associate. James Harrington owns the largest mine in the county." Keith fell into step beside her. "How are you settling in? As well as can be expected, I suppose." Penelope hesitated, then decided directness was best. "I've been asking about you. If he was offended, he didn't show it. Sensible. I'd do the same in your position. People speak well of you." A faint smile touched his lips. "I'm relieved to hear it." They walked in silence for a moment, the morning sun warming the dusty street. "I'm considering your offer," Penelope said finally. But I have questions. If the claim is truly valuable, why would you not simply offer to work it with me? A partnership that would benefit us both. Keith stopped walking, turning to face her. His expression was serious. Would you want that to stay here in Beaver? The question struck at the heart of her uncertainty. I don't know. I came here expecting to bury my father and leave. Now you have choices, he finished for her. For what it's worth, a partnership might be arranged, but I assumed you'd want to return east to civilization. There was no condescension in his tone, only a simple statement of what most Eastern women would prefer. My life in Boston is finished, Penelope admitted. My husband died last year. We had no children. My sister-in-law has made it clear that her charity has limits. Keith's eyes softened with understanding. I'm sorry. Don't be. Robert was a good man, but our marriage was. She stopped, shocked at herself for nearly confiding such personal matters to a virtual stranger. Forgive me. That's hardly relevant to our business discussion. On the contrary, it helps me understand your situation better. He gestured toward a bench outside the town's small church. May we sit for a moment? They settled on the bench, a respectable distance apart. Penelope was acutely aware of the curious glances from passers-by. A widow conversing openly with an unmarried man would certainly fuel gossip, even in a frontier town. A partnership would work like this, Keith explained. I would provide the capital to develop the mine. You would retain ownership of the claim. We would split the profits 60-40 in your favor as you're the owner. I would handle the day-to-day operations. It was more generous than she had expected. And if the mine fails to produce, then I lose my investment and you're back where you started. He met her gaze directly. It's a gamble, Mrs. Norwood, but one I believe is worth taking. Penelope considered his words carefully. I would need something in writing. Legal protection, Keith nodded. Elias Humphrey can draw up the papers. He's honest despite being a lawyer. The corner of his mouth quirked up in a half-smile. And what of my father's debts? I would settle those immediately as part of our agreement. It was tempting, perhaps too tempting. Penelope stood, needing to move. I need more time to consider. Keith rose as well. Of course. But I should mention that James Harrington has expressed interest in your father's claim as well. He'd pay more than I can offer upfront, but you'd lose any future profits. Is that a warning, Mr. Young? Keith, he corrected gently. And yes, it is. Harrington has ways of getting what he wants. Be careful. With a tip of his hat, he left her standing by the church, more confused than ever. A business partnership with a man she barely knew, remaining in this rough-edged town indefinitely. It was madness to even consider it. And yet, as she walked back to her father's cabin, Penelope found herself imagining what it might be like to build something here, to see her father's dream realized, even if it had never been her own. That evening, a knock at her door revealed Elias Humphrey, looking nervous. Mrs. Norwood, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I felt I should warn you. James Harrington came to my office today, asking about your father's claim. He's prepared to offer $500 for it, enough to pay the debts and leave you with a tidy sum. Penelope invited him in. That's generous. Why do you look so concerned? Elias removed his spectacles, cleaning them with a handkerchief. Because Harrington doesn't make generous offers without reason. If he wants that claim, there must be more value there than most realize. Keith Young seems to think so. Ah, Elias nodded. Keith approached you as well. I'm not surprised. He and your father spent many evenings discussing that claim. Mr. Humphrey, what would you advise me to do? Sell to Harrington, to Keith, or attempt to work the claim myself? The lawyer sighed. I'm not a mining man, Mrs. Norwood. But I knew your father, and he believed in that claim until his dying day. If Keith Young believes in it too, Well, that carries weight with me. He doesn't chase fantasies. After Elias left, Penelope sat by the fire thinking. Outside, the mountain darkness had settled, deeper and more absolute than any night in Boston. She felt small against it, a solitary woman in a cabin on a mountainside, trying to decide her future. A soft nickering from the lean-to reminded her that she had forgotten to check on her father's horse. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped outside. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter. The horse, an aging bay gelding named Chester, greeted her with a gentle nudge. Penelope stroked his nose, finding comfort in the simple, warm contact. "What should I do, Chester?" she murmured. "Stay in this wild place or return to a city where I no longer belong?" Chester offered no advice, only a soft snort that clouded in the cold air. A sound from the trail made her turn. A rider was approaching, a dark silhouette against the starlit path. Fear flashed through her. She was alone, vulnerable, but then the rider came close enough for her to recognize. "Keith." She stepped forward, drawing her shawl tighter. "What are you doing here at this hour?" He dismounted, leading his horse the last few yards. "Forgive the intrusion." "I've just come from town. Harrington is planning to file a competing claim on your father's land first thing tomorrow. Says there was an irregularity in the original filing." "Can he do that?" "Not legally, no. But the mining commissioner is in his pocket. By the time you fought it in court, you'd be ruined by legal fees." Anger flared in her chest. "So he means to steal it from me, in effect, yes. Unless—" Keith hesitated. "Unless we file an improvement notice tonight, show that active work is being continued on the claim." "Tonight? How?" "I've brought supplies." He indicated his saddlebags. "Enough to stake a formal improvement, but we'd need to ride up to the claim site now." Penelope glanced at the dark trail leading up the mountain. "At night? Is that safe? I know these trails by heart, and the moon is bright enough. But I won't lie to you, it's not without risk." She considered for only a moment. "I'll get my coat." Minutes later, they were riding up the mountainside, Keith leading the way on his gray, Penelope following on Chester. The night was clear, the stars brilliant overhead. Despite the circumstances, Penelope felt a strange exhilaration, a feeling she had almost forgotten in the years of dutiful marriage and quiet widowhood. At the claim site, Keith quickly set to work, hammering posts and mounting a small sign declaring continued improvements by the rightful owner. Penelope held the lantern, watching him work with efficient movements. "Will this truly stop Harrington?" she asked as he drove the final stake. "It complicates things for him, makes his case weaker." Keith straightened, wiping his brow despite the cool night air. "But he won't give up easily. He's not used to being crossed. Then we'll need to move quickly with our partnership." The words came without conscious thought, surprising them both. Keith studied her face in the lantern light. "You've decided then?" "Yes." Penelope met his gaze steadily. "My father believed in this claim." "You believe in it. Perhaps it's time I believed in something again, too." A slow smile spread across Keith's face, transforming his features. "We'll make it work, Mrs. Norwood. You have my word." As they rode back down the mountain, side by side now, Penelope felt a curious lightness. For the first time since Robert's death, perhaps even before she was making choices that were truly her own. Dawn found her at Elias Humphrey's office, Keith at her side, signing the partnership agreement. The lawyer looked bemused by the early hour and their evident haste, but he drew up the papers correctly, notarizing them with his official seal. "Congratulations," he said, handing copies to each of them. "You are now officially business partners." As they left the office, Penelope noticed James Harrington across the street, watching them with narrowed eyes. Keith followed her gaze. "He knows," Keith said quietly, "and he won't be pleased. Let him be displeased." Penelope squared her shoulders. The claim is legally mine, and our partnership is now legally binding. Keith's expression was admiring. You're a formidable woman, Penelope Norwood. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a small shiver through her that had nothing to do with the morning chill. I'm beginning to believe I might be, she replied. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. Keith hired a crew of experienced miners men he trusted to begin proper development of the claim. Penelope surprised herself by taking an active interest in the operation, learning about mining techniques and geology from Keith's patient explanations. She moved her few belongings into town, taking a room at the hotel. The cabin held too many memories of her father, and it was too far from the developing business. In town, she could meet with Keith daily, review progress, and make decisions together. The partnership flourished. Keith's instincts about the vein proved correct within 3 weeks. They had extracted enough high-grade ore to pay off her father's debts entirely. By the 6th week, they had hired additional men and expanded their operation. Through it all, James Harrington watched from the sidelines, occasionally making offers to buy them out, each one higher than the last. Each time they refused. He knows something we don't, Penelope said one evening as they sat reviewing accounts in Keith's office. Why else would he be so persistent? Keith leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. I've been wondering the same. Tomorrow, I'd like to explore the northern boundary of the claim. There's something about the rock formation there that's been nagging at me. I'll come with you. He smiled, no longer surprised by her involvement. Over the weeks, their professional relationship had developed an easy rhythm. Keith never treated her as less capable because she was a woman, and Penelope had come to trust his judgment implicitly. What she hadn't expected was how much she would come to enjoy his company. Their discussions ranged far beyond business literature, politics, their pasts. She learned that he had fought for the Confederacy not out of belief in the cause but out of duty to his home state. That he had lost his wife and infant daughter to typhoid fever before the war. That he had come west afterward, unable to face rebuilding in a Virginia that no longer felt like home. In turn, she told him about her marriage to Robert, respectable but passionless, entered into at her parents' urging rather than from love. About her grief when he died, mixed with a shameful sense of release. About her dream, long abandoned, of writing stories that might someday be published. Why abandoned? Keith had asked. Robert thought it unsuitable for a banker's wife to appear in print, and then, I suppose I grew too old for such dreams. Keith had given her a long look then. No one's too old for dreams, Penelope. Now, in his office with ledgers spread between them, she found herself studying his profile as he examined a map of their claim. The lantern light softened the lines of his face, glinting on the silver at his temples. At 45, he was a decade her senior, but he moved with the energy of a much younger man, especially when excited by a new discovery at the mine. He looked up, catching her gaze. "Penny for your thoughts." The nickname had emerged naturally weeks ago, and she found she liked it from him. "I was thinking about how different my life is from what I imagined when I arrived here. Better or worse? Different," she repeated, but smiled. "But not worse, not at all." His answering smile warmed her more than it should have. "I'm glad." The moment stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with something neither acknowledged. Finally, Keith cleared his throat and returned to the map. "We should head out early tomorrow. The days are getting shorter and I want plenty of daylight for exploring." Penelope nodded, gathering her shawl. "I'll be ready at first light." As she walked back to the hotel through Beaver's quiet streets, Penelope reflected on how completely the town had transformed in her eyes. What had seemed a dusty backwater now felt vibrant with possibility. She recognized shopkeepers, miners, the wives who had cautiously welcomed her into their small social circle once they realized she wasn't putting on airs despite her Eastern background. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The next morning dawned clear, but cold winter was approaching rapidly in the high country. Penelope dressed warmly in the practical clothes she had acquired. A heavy skirt, sturdy boots, and a man's flannel shirt beneath her wool coat. Her Boston friends would have been scandalized, but out here, practicality trumped fashion. Keith was waiting outside the hotel with their horses. His approving glance at her attire sent a small thrill through her. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked, helping her mount. "Lead on, Mr. Young." They rode up the now familiar trail to the claim, but instead of stopping at the main workings, Keith led them farther, following the ridge northward. The terrain grew rougher, the pine trees thicker. Eventually they dismounted, continuing on foot. "This is the northern boundary of your father's claim," Keith explained, pointing to a stake driven into the ground. "Beyond that is unclaimed land, at least it was. I suspect Harrington may have filed on it. Why would that matter to us? We have the vein on our property." Keith knelt, examining the rock formation that emerged from the soil. "That's what I've been wondering about. Your father's vein runs northeast. If it continues past our boundary, understanding dawned. Harrington wants both claims. He's trying to follow the same vein." "Exactly." Keith stood, dusting off his hands. "Let's follow this ridge a bit further." They hiked along the boundary, scrambling over boulders and pushing through underbrush. Penelope was grateful for her practical clothing as branches caught at her skirt. Keith stayed close, offering a hand over difficult terrain. After nearly an hour, they reached a small plateau. Keith stopped abruptly, staring at something ahead. Penelope followed his gaze and saw a crude shelter and the unmistakable signs of prospecting, a small pile of tailings, tools scattered nearby. "Someone's been working here recently," Keith said, his voice tight. "And they've found something." He pointed to fresh drill marks in an outcropping of quartz similar to the vein on their claim. They approached cautiously. The shelter was empty, but signs of recent occupation were evident: ashes still warm in a small fire pit, a coffee pot set aside. "Harrington's men," Keith muttered. "They must be working in shifts." He examined the rock face closely, then whistled softly. "Penny, look at this." He pointed to a section of the quartz where yellow metal gleamed richly. "This is even higher grade than our main vein if this connects to our deposit." A twig snapped behind them. They turned to find 3 men emerging from the trees, rifles in hand. The leader, a burly man with a scar across one cheek, smiled unpleasantly. "Well now, what have we here? Trespassers, I reckon." Keith stepped slightly in front of Penelope. "We're on the boundary of our own claim, Murray." "Just taking a look around." The man Murray spat. "Mr. Harrington says this here's his claim now. Says you two are trying to steal what's rightfully his." "That's a lie and you know it." Keith's voice remained calm, but Penelope could sense the tension in him. "Our claim was filed legally years ago. If Harrington has filed adjacent, that's his business, but he has no right to the Norwood claim." Murray's grin widened. "Funny thing about claims, papers can get lost. Stakes can get moved." He gestured with his rifle. "Mr. Harrington says to bring you to him if we caught you sniffing around. He wants a word." Penelope felt cold fear wash over her. "We're not going anywhere with you." "The lady's got spirit," one of the other men snickered. "Harrington didn't say to bring her, Murray." "Maybe we could." "Shut up, Tanner." Murray cut him off, but his eyes lingered on Penelope in a way that made her skin crawl. "The lady comes too. Harrington can decide what to do with her." Keith's hand moved subtly toward his hip, where Penelope knew he carried a revolver. "That's not happening, Murray." The standoff might have escalated further if not for the sound of horses approaching. All heads turned as 4 riders appeared, the foreman from their mine and 3 workers, all armed. "Everything all right, boss?" The foreman called, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. Murray's confidence faltered visibly. "This ain't over, young. Harrington doesn't take kindly to being crossed." With a jerk of his head, he signaled his companions to withdraw. When they had disappeared back into the trees, Keith released a long breath. That was fortunate timing. The foreman dismounted, approaching them. "Not really fortunate, boss. We saw Harrington's men heading this way earlier and figured you might need some help." Keith clasped the man's shoulder gratefully. "Good thinking, Dave. I owe you." "What now?" Penelope asked, her heart still racing from the confrontation. Keith's expression was grim. "Now we need to secure our claim beyond any doubt and find out exactly what Harrington is up to." They returned to town with their escorts, the encounter with Harrington's men casting a shadow over their discovery. In Keith's office, they met with Elias Humphrey to explain the situation. "If Harrington is trying to jump your claim, we need to file additional paperwork immediately," the lawyer said, already pulling out forms. "And I'd suggest hiring men to guard the site around the clock." "Already done," Keith confirmed. "But I'm more concerned about why Harrington is so interested in that particular section of land. The vein we found today is rich, but rich enough to risk legal action. Criminal action, even." "There must be something more," Penelope said thoughtfully. "Something we're missing." Elias cleared his throat nervously. "There is a rumor, but it's probably nothing." "What rumor?" Keith leaned forward intently. "Well, the railroad survey came through last month. There's talk they might route the new spur line through that northern valley, the one that borders your claim." Keith and Penelope exchanged glances. "If the railroad comes through there," Keith began. "The value of that land would increase exponentially," Penelope finished. "Not just for mining, but for development." Elias nodded. "Precisely, and Harrington has friends on the railroad board." Keith stood abruptly. "I need to see those survey maps. Where would they be filed?" "County Recorder's office in Central City," Elias replied. "But it's a 2-day ride, and with winter coming on." "I'll leave tomorrow." Keith's determination was evident in every line of his body. "We need to know what we're up against." Penelope rose as well. "I'm coming with you." Keith turned to her, surprise evident on his face. "Penny, it's a hard ride and the weather could turn." "It's my claim, my father's legacy," she interrupted firmly. "And I'm your partner. I'm coming." After a moment, Keith's expression softened into something like admiration. "All right, partner, we leave at dawn." That night, Penelope packed a small bag, her mind racing with possibilities. If the railroad was indeed coming through, their claim and her father's adjacent land could be worth far more than they had imagined. No wonder Harrington was so determined. A soft knock at her hotel room door startled her from her thoughts. Opening it cautiously, she found Keith standing in the hallway, his expression troubled. "May I come in for a moment?" he asked. It was improper, of course, a man visiting a woman's room alone at night, but propriety seemed a distant concern given their circumstances. Penelope stepped aside to let him enter. "What's wrong?" she asked, closing the door. Keith paced the small room restlessly. "I've just had a visit from one of Harrington's men, not one of the thugs from today, but his business manager. He offered to buy our claim for 3 times what it's worth." "And you refused, of course." Keith stopped pacing, turning to face her. "But he made it clear that Harrington won't take no for an answer. He hinted at consequences." "Threats?" Penelope felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain night, not directly, but clear enough. Keith ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his agitation. "Penny, I'm concerned about this trip to Central City. If Harrington is desperate enough, he might try to stop us from seeing those survey maps." "All the more reason for us to go," she said firmly. "We need to know what we're fighting for." Keith studied her face for a long moment. "You've changed since you arrived in Beaver." "Have I?" The woman who stepped off that stagecoach would never have considered a 2-day ride into the mountains in November, or standing up to a man like Harrington. Penelope smiled slightly. "Perhaps I've rediscovered parts of myself that I had forgotten, or perhaps I've discovered new parts entirely." Keith moved closer, his blue eyes intent on hers. "Penny, if anything were to happen to you because of this business venture—" "Nothing will happen," she assured him, though she couldn't possibly know that. "We'll be careful." He was close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. For a wild moment, she thought he might kiss her. More surprising was the realization that she wanted him to. Instead, he stepped back, clearing his throat. "We should get some rest. Long day tomorrow." "Yes," she agreed, inexplicably disappointed. "Dawn comes early." At the door he paused, looking back at her. "Penny." "Yes, I'm glad you decided to stay in Beaver." With that, he was gone, leaving her to wonder at the strange ache in her chest that felt remarkably like longing. The journey to Central City was arduous, just as Keith had warned. They rode out of Beaver as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Their breath clouded before them, and frost crunched beneath their horses' hooves. By midday, they had climbed into higher country, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of aspen, their golden leaves long since fallen. Keith set a steady pace, occasionally glancing back to check on her, but Penelope managed well despite the challenging terrain. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried meat. Sitting on a fallen log, Penelope pulled her coat tighter against the chill wind. "How much farther today?" she asked, accepting the coffee Keith had brewed over a small fire. "Another 4 hours or so. There's a way station at Pine Creek where we can spend the night." "Not luxurious, but it's shelter." Penelope smiled. "After weeks in Beaver, my standards for luxury have adjusted considerably." Keith returned her smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You've adapted well to frontier life for a Boston lady." "I was never much of a Boston lady," she admitted. "Always a bit too blunt, too curious too. Much, according to my mother-in-law." "I can't imagine you being too much of anything," Keith said quietly, his gaze lingering on her face. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Then Keith cleared his throat and stood, dousing the fire. "We should keep moving. I don't like the look of those clouds." Penelope glanced at the sky where dark clouds were indeed gathering over the western peaks. "Will we make it to Pine Creek before the storm?" "If we push on, yes." Keith helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "Stay close behind me. The trail gets tricky from here." They rode in silence for the next few hours, the trail narrowing as it wound along a steep ridge. Below them, a river rushed through a rocky gorge, swollen with recent rainfall. Above, the clouds continued to build, dark and threatening. The first snowflakes began to fall as they rounded a bend and saw the way station, a sturdy log building with smoke rising from its chimney. Penelope had never been so glad to see a simple structure. Inside, they found a common room with a blazing fire and a half-dozen other travelers waiting out the weather. The station keeper, a grizzled man named Peterson, greeted Keith with recognition. "Young, ain't seen you in months. What brings you up this way?" His eyes shifted to Penelope with obvious curiosity. Business in Central City, Keith replied, helping Penelope remove her snow-dusted coat. Mrs. Norwood is my business partner. We'll need rooms for the night. Peterson's eyebrows rose at the word partner, but he made no comment beyond. Only got one room left, with the storm bringing folks in. You're welcome to it, or one of you can take a spot by the fire out here. Keith looked to Penelope, leaving the decision to her. She hesitated only briefly. We'll take the room, thank you. Once they had settled their horses in the barn and brought in their saddlebags, Peterson showed them to a small room at the back of the building. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and little else. I'll sleep on the floor, Keith said immediately when they were alone. You take the bed. Don't be ridiculous. The floor is freezing and you need rest as much as I do. Penelope began unpinning her hair, practical as always. The bed is small but adequate for both of us if we're careful. We're both adults, Keith. Keith's expression was unreadable. As you wish. They ate supper in the common room, a hearty stew and fresh bread, before retiring early. Outside, the snow fell more heavily, the wind howling around the eaves of the sturdy building. In their room, Penelope changed into her nightgown behind a makeshift screen of her coat hung from a wall peg. When she emerged, Keith had already removed his boots and outer clothing, leaving him in trousers and an undershirt. He was adding wood to the small stove in the corner. It will be cold by morning, he said, not looking at her. I've asked Peterson to wake us at first light. With luck, the storm will have passed. Penelope slipped under the blankets, moving close to the wall to leave as much space as possible. After a moment's hesitation, Keith extinguished the lamp and joined her, lying rigidly on his back at the edge of the mattress. For several minutes, neither spoke. Penelope was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the warmth of him, the scent of pine and leather that seemed to cling to his skin. Outside, the storm intensified, wind rattling the single window. Keith, she said softly, may I ask you something personal? He turned his head toward her, though she could barely make out his features in the darkness. Of course. Why did you never remarry, after your wife died? The question had been on her mind for some time. A man like Keith, capable, kind, reasonably prosperous, would have been considered a good match by many women, even in a place like Beaver where women were scarce. He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low and thoughtful. At first, grief. Caroline and I had been sweethearts since childhood, her death and our daughters. It nearly destroyed me. He shifted slightly, his shoulder now touching hers. Then the war came, and afterward I wasn't fit company for anyone, let alone a wife. By the time I came west and found some measure of peace, I suppose I'd grown accustomed to solitude. And now, the question slipped out before she could reconsider it. Keith turned on his side to face her, though the darkness still hid his expression. Now I find myself wondering if solitude is as satisfying as I once believed. Penelope's heart quickened. I understand that feeling well. His hand found hers beneath the blankets, his fingers warm as they entwined with hers. Do you ever wonder, Penny, what might have happened if you hadn't come west, if your father hadn't called you here? I try not to think about it, she admitted. My life in Boston had become colorless, empty. I was merely existing, not living. And now I feel alive again, purposeful. She squeezed his hand gently. Thank you for that. For what? For believing in my father's dream when I couldn't. For giving me a chance to build something new. Keith's voice was husky when he replied. You've given me something too, Penny. Something I thought I'd lost for good. What's that? Hope, he said simply. Hope for a future that isn't just about survival. The intimacy of the moment, the darkness, the storm outside, it all conspired to create a bubble of privacy that felt removed from the world and its judgments. Penelope found herself shifting closer, drawn to his warmth, to the comfort of his presence. "Keith," she whispered, not entirely sure what she was asking for. He seemed to understand nonetheless. His free hand came up to touch her face, fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Penny," he murmured, and then his lips found hers in the darkness. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he expected her to pull away. When she didn't instead, she moved closer, her hand coming to rest against his chest. The kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and needful. Penelope had never been kissed like this, not by her proper Boston husband, certainly not by any of the few beaux who had courted her in her youth. This was a man's kiss, passionate and unrestrained, and she responded with a fervor that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Keith rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he confessed. Penelope smiled in the darkness. "Why didn't you?" "I wasn't sure how you felt, if you were ready, if I was just your business partner and nothing more." She touched his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. "You are far more than that, Keith Young. Far more." He kissed her again, drawing her closer until she was nestled against him, her head on his shoulder. Outside, the storm raged on, but within their small room they had found a harbor. They talked late into the night, sharing memories and hopes, learning each other in ways that went beyond the physical. When sleep finally claimed them, they remained entwined, as if neither wanted to let go even in dreams. Morning brought clear skies and brilliant sunshine that turned the fresh snow into a dazzling blanket across the landscape. They rode out early, both a little shy after the intimacy of the night before, yet more comfortable with each other than ever. The trail to Central City was well-traveled enough that the snow posed little difficulty. They arrived by mid-afternoon, the mining town bustling despite the winter weather. The county recorder's office was located in a stone building off the main street, its official appearance a stark contrast to Beaver's more rustic structures. Inside, Keith approached the clerk, explaining their purpose. The young man seemed eager to help until Keith mentioned the railroad survey maps. "I'm afraid those aren't public records yet, sir," he said apologetically. "They're still considered preliminary findings for railroad officials only." Keith frowned. "We need to verify a potential route through Beaver County. It's a matter of some urgency." The clerk hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I'm not supposed to. That is, I could lose my position." Penelope stepped forward, smiling warmly. "We understand your concern. Perhaps there's a way we could examine the maps briefly without compromising your position. We would be most grateful." She placed a $20 gold piece discreetly on the counter. The clerk's eyes widened at the sum. After a moment's deliberation, he pocketed the coin. "I take my lunch in 15 minutes. The survey maps are in the third cabinet from the window. I'll be gone for precisely half an hour." Keith nodded his understanding. "Much obliged." When the clerk had left, they quickly located the cabinet and found the rolled maps inside. Keith spread them on a nearby table, weighing down the corners with books. "Here," he said, pointing to Beaver County on the large survey map. "There's our claim, and there's the Northern Valley." Penelope leaned closer, studying the proposed rail line marked in red ink. "It cuts right through the northern section, right where we saw Harrington's men working." Keith traced the line with his finger. "And look here, they've marked a potential station site, right at the junction of our claim and the adjacent land." "No wonder Harrington wants control of both properties," Penelope breathed. "A railroad station would make that land worth a fortune." Keith's expression was grim. "And he's willing to go to great lengths to get it. The question is, what do we do now?" Penelope studied the map intently. "The survey isn't finalized yet. See these notations. They're considering an alternate route through Willow Canyon 5 miles east, if the railroad chose that route instead. Keith began. Harrington's plans would be worthless, Penelope finished. And he'd have no reason to threaten our claim. But how do we influence the railroad's decision? We don't have Harrington's connections. Penelope tapped the map thoughtfully. Perhaps we don't need connections. We need facts. Look here, the survey notes mention potential instability in the soil along the Northern Valley route. If we could provide evidence that the Willow Canyon route is safer, more economical. Keith's eyes lit with understanding. We'd need an independent geological survey, and quickly. Do you know someone who could do it? As a matter of fact, I do. An old friend from Virginia who works for the Colorado Geological Survey now. Lives right here in Central City. Penelope smiled. Then let's pay him a visit, partner. They carefully replaced the maps and left the recorder's office, stepping back into the bright winter sunshine. Keith led the way through Central City streets to a modest house on a side street, where his friend, Professor William Harrison, welcomed them warmly. Over coffee, Keith explained their situation and their need for an independent survey. The professor, a bearded man with kind eyes and an enthusiastic manner, listened intently. Fascinating, he said when Keith had finished. And concerning, if Harrington is attempting to manipulate the railroad's decision for personal gain, I'd be happy to conduct a survey of both routes. How quickly could you do it? Penelope asked. I could leave tomorrow, weather permitting. The survey itself would take perhaps a week. He stroked his beard thoughtfully. But I should warn you, if the Northern Valley truly is the better route, my report will reflect that, regardless of how it affects your situation. We understand, Keith assured him. We only want a fair assessment, based on scientific fact rather than financial influence. The professor nodded approvingly. Then I'll prepare to depart tomorrow. I'll need to gather equipment and assistance. As they left the professor's house, Penelope felt a cautious optimism. Do you think it will work? Keith took her hand, squeezing it gently. It's our best chance. Harrison is respected in his field, and he has no ties to either Harrington or us that might compromise his findings. They found rooms at Central City's best hotel, separate rooms this time, as befitted propriety in a larger town where they might be observed. But after dinner in the hotel restaurant, Keith escorted Penelope to her door, lingering. I find I've grown accustomed to your company at night, he said softly, his eyes warm as they held hers. Penelope felt a blush rise to her cheeks. As have I. But we should be careful of appearances, especially now. Keith nodded, understanding her concern. In their business dealings, any hint of impropriety could be used against them, particularly by someone as unscrupulous as Harrington, when we returned to Beaver. He began, then hesitated. Yes, she prompted, when this is all settled, when our claim is secure and the railroad matter resolved. He took her hands in his. Penny, I want to court you properly, not in secret, not as merely a business partner, if you'll allow it. The formality of the request, so at odds with the passion they had shared the night before, made her smile. I think I would like that very much, Keith Young. He kissed her then, briefly but tenderly, before stepping back. We should leave at first light tomorrow. I want to be back at the claim as soon as possible. The return journey to Beaver was thankfully uneventful, though the winter weather made for slow going in places. They arrived late in the evening of the second day, tired but determined to protect what was theirs. At the mine the next morning, they found their foreman, Dave, waiting with troubling news. During their absence, Harrington's men had twice attempted to access their claim, only to be turned away by the guards Keith had posted. They're getting bold, Dave reported. Last night they brought more men, 8 or 9 of them. There was nearly a shooting. Keith's expression darkened. We need to increase security until Harrison completes his survey. And we need to ensure our legal position is unassailable, Penelope added. I'll speak with Elias today about filing additional documentation. For the next week, they maintained a vigilant watch over the claim while going about their business in town with an appearance of normality. Harrington, for his part, made no direct move against them, though they often felt his eyes on them as they moved about Beaver. On the evening of the 6th day after their return, Penelope was working late in their office, reviewing financial records. The winter darkness had fallen hours ago, and the town was mostly quiet. Many establishments closed early due to the cold. A knock at the door startled her. Keith had gone to check on the night guards at the mine and wasn't expected back for hours. Cautiously, Penelope approached the door. "Who is it?" "Murray, madam, James Harrington's man. I've got a message for you and Young." Penelope hesitated, remembering their encounter on the claim. Opening the door to Murray seemed unwise, but ignoring him might provoke whatever action Harrington was planning. "Slide it under the door," she called finally. A moment's pause, then an envelope appeared in the narrow space beneath the door. Penelope picked it up, breaking the seal to find a brief note in elegant handwriting. "I propose a meeting to resolve our differences amicably. Tomorrow, noon, at my office. Come alone, both of you, or I shall be forced to take more direct action regarding the claim in question." The implied threat was clear enough. Penelope refolded the note, mind racing. Should they accept the meeting? It could be a trap, but refusing might escalate the situation further. She was still considering when the door opened and Keith entered, stamping snow from his boots. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "What is it?" She handed him the note. Keith read it quickly, his expression hardening. "A trap, obviously. But can we afford to ignore it?" Keith removed his coat, moving to stoke the small stove that heated the office. "No. But we won't go alone, either. I'll arrange for Dave and some of the men to be nearby, just in case. Do you think Harrison will have completed his survey by then? It might strengthen our position if we knew which way the railroad was leaning. I'll send a messenger to Central City first thing tomorrow." Keith turned to her, his face softened by concern. "You don't have to attend this meeting, Penny. I can handle Harrington." Penelope straightened. "We're partners, remember? I won't hide while you face danger on our behalf." Keith smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. "I should know better than to suggest otherwise by now." He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "But promise me you'll be careful. Harrington is dangerous, especially when cornered." "As am I," Penelope replied with more confidence than she felt. "A cornered widow with nothing to lose can be quite formidable." Keith's laugh was warm as he drew her into an embrace. "Remind me never to cross you, Mrs. Norwood." The next morning brought fresh snow and bitter cold. Penelope dressed with care, choosing her most businesslike attire, a dark blue wool dress with minimal ornamentation, her hair neatly pinned. If she was to face Harrington as an equal, she would look the part. Keith collected her from the hotel at 11:30, his face grim with determination. "Dave and 4 men will be positioned around Harrington's office," he told her as they walked through the snow-covered streets. "If anything seems amiss, we leave immediately." Harrington's office was located above the town bank, a relatively new brick building that stood out among Beaver's predominantly wooden structures. A clerk showed them up a narrow staircase to a well-appointed room with a large desk and leather chairs. James Harrington rose as they entered, a tall, heavy-set man with silver at his temples and cold eyes that assessed them calculatingly. "Mrs. Norwood, Mr. Young, thank you for accepting my invitation." "We're here to listen, Harrington," Keith said bluntly. "Nothing more." Harrington gestured to the chairs opposite his desk. "Please sit. Can I offer you refreshments, coffee, something stronger perhaps?" "No, thank you," Penelope replied coolly. "We'd prefer to get directly to business." Harrington's smile didn't reach his eyes. "As you wish." He resumed his own seat, folding his hands on the desk. "I'll be frank. You have something I want the Norwood claim. I'm prepared to offer you $10,000 for it. A generous sum, I think you'll agree." Keith's expression remained impassive. Why the sudden interest in a small gold claim? "Your operations are much larger elsewhere. Let's not play games, young. We both know the railroad is coming through. The value of that land will increase tenfold once the announcement is made." "So you admit you've had inside information about the railroad's plans," Penelope said. "Information not available to other landowners who might be affected." Harrington's gaze shifted to her, reassessing. "Business is about information, Mrs. Norwood. I simply have better sources than most. And when those sources dry up," Keith leaned forward slightly. "When the railroad chooses an alternate route, perhaps," for the first time, Harrington's confident demeanor faltered. "What are you implying?" "The Colorado Geological Survey is currently evaluating both proposed routes," Penelope explained, watching his reaction carefully. "Their findings will be submitted directly to the railroad board, bypassing any influence parties." Anger flashed in Harrington's eyes. "You're bluffing." "Professor William Harrison began his survey last week," Keith said calmly. "We expect his report any day now." Harrington stood abruptly. "Harrison, that self-righteous academic," he paced behind his desk, clearly rattled. "It won't matter. I have arrangements in place. The northern route is decided." "Unless Harrison's report indicates that it's unsafe," Penelope countered. "The railroad won't risk accidents or costly maintenance if there's a more stable alternative." Harrington stopped pacing, his expression calculating once more. "Perhaps we've been approaching this from the wrong angle. We could be partners in this venture." "With my connections and your land—" "No," Keith interrupted firmly. "We're not interested in any partnership with you, Harrington. Not after your men threatened Mrs. Norwood and attempted to jump our claim." "A misunderstanding," Harrington waved dismissively. "Overzealous employees." "Acting on your orders," Penelope said. "No, Mr. Harrington. We came here today out of courtesy and to avoid further conflict. But our position is clear. The Norwood claim is not for sale at any price." Harrington's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, a serious one." "The only mistake was thinking we could reason with you." Keith stood, offering his hand to Penelope. "This meeting is over." As they turned to leave, Harrington called after them. "This isn't finished, young. Not by a long shot. That claim will be mine one way or another." Outside, in the clear winter air, Penelope released a shaky breath. That went about as well as expected. Keith took her arm, guiding her through the snow. "He's desperate, and that makes him unpredictable. What do we do now?" "We wait for Harrison's report, and we stay vigilant." Keith's expression was troubled. "Harrington won't give up easily, not with so much at stake." The next few days passed in tense anticipation. They doubled the guards at the mine, working in shifts to ensure the claim was protected around the clock. In town, they were careful never to be alone, always aware of Harrington's men watching their movements. On the fourth day after their meeting with Harrington, a rider arrived from Central City, bringing a sealed envelope from Professor Harrison. Keith and Penelope retreated to their office to read it privately. The report was detailed and unambiguous. The Northern Valley route, which would pass through their claim and Harrington's adjacent land, was deemed unsuitable due to unstable soil conditions and the potential for landslides. The professor strongly recommended the alternate route through Willow Canyon as safer and ultimately more economical, despite being slightly longer. He did it, Penelope breathed, reading the conclusion again. The railroad will have to choose the eastern route now. Keith nodded, relief evident in his face. Harrington's land speculation is worthless, and without the railroad, he has no reason to pursue our claim so aggressively. Should we inform him? Keith considered. Not directly. Harrison will submit his findings to the railroad board today. Word will spread quickly enough once the decision is official. That evening, they celebrated quietly in Keith's small house on the edge of town, a modest cabin, but more comfortable than her hotel room for a private dinner together. Over a meal Keith had prepared himself, they allowed themselves to relax for the first time in weeks. "What happens now?" Penelope asked as they sat before the fire afterward, a glass of whiskey warming her hands. "With the mine, I mean." Keith settled beside her on the small sofa. "We continue operations. The vein is still producing well, and without Harrington's interference we can focus on proper development." "And us?" she asked more quietly. "What happens with us now, Keith?" He took her glass, setting it aside before taking both her hands in his. "That depends entirely on you, Penny. On me." "Yes." His blue eyes were serious as they held hers. "I know what I want. I've known for some time now, but I need to be sure it's what you want too." Penelope's heart quickened. "And what is it you want, Keith Young?" "You," he said simply. "A life with you, marriage if you'll have me." The directness of it so like him brought tears to her eyes. "Keith." "I know it might seem sudden," he continued, misreading her emotion as hesitation, "and I understand if you need time to consider. Your life here would be very different from what you knew in Boston. Harder in many ways. I can't offer you the luxuries you're accustomed to." Penelope placed her fingers against his lips, silencing him. "Keith Young, when have you ever known me to care about luxuries? What you offer is worth far more to me, a partnership of equals, work that matters, and—" She paused, finding the words. "And love. That's what this is between us, isn't it? Love." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise in the mountains, warm and full of promise. "Yes, Penny. That's exactly what it is. I love you, more than I thought possible after Caroline. Different but no less real." "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both strange and perfectly right on her lips. "And yes, I will marry you whenever and however you wish." He gathered her into his arms then, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and dreams renewed. Penelope melted against him, reveling in the certainty that she had found where she belonged at last. A sharp knock at the door startled them apart. Keith rose, hand moving instinctively to the revolver he kept nearby. "Who's there?" "Dave, boss. We got trouble at the mine." Keith opened the door to find their foreman, breathless and agitated. "Harrington's men, at least a dozen of them. They've got torches, dynamite. They're threatening to blow the entrance if we don't clear out." Keith grabbed his coat. "Get the sheriff and any men you can find. I'll go ahead." "Keith, no." Penelope caught his arm. "It's too dangerous. Wait for help." "There's no time," he said grimly. "If they destroy the main tunnel, it could take months to reopen the mine if it can be reopened at all." "Then I'm coming with you," she declared, already reaching for her own coat. "Penny, don't argue. We're partners, remember." Her tone brooked no disagreement. Minutes later, they were riding hard through the snow-covered landscape, following the trail to the mine. The night was clear, the moon full, casting the world in silver light that made the white ground glow eerily. As they approached the claim, they could see the flickering of torches and hear angry voices. Keith signaled for them to dismount and approach on foot, using the boulders for cover. From their vantage point, they could see Harrington himself with his men, facing off against the small group of guards who had been posted at the mine. Murray and another thug were placing what looked like dynamite charges at the entrance to the main tunnel. "Harrington's lost his mind," Keith muttered. "He must have heard about Harrison's report already." "What can we do?" Penelope whispered. "We're outnumbered and they're armed." Keith's expression was grim. "We need to stall until Dave brings help, if I can get Harrington talking." Before Penelope could protest, Keith stepped out from behind the boulder, hands raised to show he was unarmed. "Harrington, what do you think you're doing?" All heads turned at his voice. Harrington's face twisted with anger. "Young, just the man I wanted to see. Come to watch your precious mine go up in smoke." Keith moved forward slowly, drawing attention away from where Penelope remained hidden. "This won't change anything, Harrington. The railroad's decision is made. Destroying our mine won't bring it through your land." "Maybe not," Harrington snarled. "But it'll ensure you don't profit either. An eye for an eye, young. You ruined me, I'll ruin you." "The only person who ruined you is yourself," Keith replied evenly. "Your greed, your dishonesty." The railroad would have chosen the eastern route regardless. The northern valley was never stable enough. Harrington gestured angrily to Murray. "Light the fuse. Let's be done with this." "James Harrington." Penelope's voice rang out as she stepped into view. "Stop this madness immediately." Harrington's eyes widened in surprise. "Mrs. Norwood, this doesn't concern you. Go back to town where it's safe." "This is my claim," she said firmly, walking forward to stand beside Keith. "My father's legacy. If you destroy it, I'll see you hang for it. I swear I will." Something in her tone, the absolute conviction, made Harrington hesitate. In that moment of uncertainty, the sound of approaching riders broke the tense silence. The sheriff and at least a dozen armed men appeared over the ridge, Dave leading them. Harrington's men began to back away, looking to their employer for direction. Harrington himself seemed to deflate, the madness leaving his eyes as reality reasserted itself. "It's over, Harrington," Keith said quietly. "Let it go." For one terrible moment, Penelope thought Harrington might order the fuse lit anyway, out of pure spite. But then his shoulders sagged, and he raised his hands in surrender. "Take them," the sheriff ordered his deputies. Destruction of property, attempted arson, threatening with deadly weapons that ought to keep them in jail for a good long while. As Harrington was led away, he looked back at Keith and Penelope with cold hatred. "This isn't over. I'll be back." Keith's arm went around Penelope's shoulders. "No, you won't. Your investors will pull out when they learn you've been arrested. Your empire is finished, Harrington." They watched as the sheriff's men disarmed the dynamite charges and secured the mine entrance. The danger had passed, but Penelope found herself trembling now that the immediate crisis was over. Keith turned to her, concern in his eyes. "Are you all right?" "Just the aftermath, I think," she managed a shaky smile. "I didn't know I could be so forceful." Keith's laugh was warm with pride. "You were magnificent. Harrington didn't stand a chance. Under a sky brilliant with stars, with the mountains standing silent witness, he drew her into his arms. "I think," he said softly, "that I'm the luckiest man in Colorado territory." Penelope looked up at him, this man who had helped her rebuild her life when she thought it finished, who had shown her that dreams were not just for the young. "We're both lucky," she whispered, "to have found each other, to have this second chance." His kiss was a promise of protection, of partnership, of a future brighter than either had dared to imagine. Spring came early to Beaver that year. The snow melted from the mountains, revealing meadows vibrant with wildflowers. The town itself seemed to flourish in the warming days, new buildings rising, more families arriving as word spread of the mining opportunities. The Norwood Young Mine, as it was now called, had become one of the most productive in the county. The vain Keith and Penelope had discovered that fateful day had indeed been rich, yielding enough gold to make them, if not wealthy, then certainly comfortable. On a perfect May morning, with the aspen trees just beginning to leaf out in delicate green, Penelope Norwood became Penelope Young in a simple ceremony at Beaver's small church. The entire town turned out for the occasion, miners from their claim, shopkeepers who had become friends, even Elias Humphrey, beaming with pride as if he had personally arranged the match. "I never thought I'd marry again," Penelope confessed to Martha Williams as they watched Keith greeting well-wishers after the ceremony. "I believed that part of my life was over." "Nonsense," Martha said briskly. "You're barely past 35, far too young to give up on happiness." Penelope smiled, remembering words spoken months ago on a mountainside. "I'm too old for dreams," she had told Keith once, exhausted and discouraged. "I've got enough for both of us," he had replied. He had been right, of course. Dreams didn't expire with youth or fade with disappointment. They merely waited dormant for the right conditions to flourish again. Keith approached, handsome in his new suit, blue eyes bright with joy. "Mrs. Young," he said, offering his arm, "shall we lead our guests to the celebration?" Penelope took his arm, feeling the strength in him, the steadiness that had become her foundation. "Lead on, Mr. Young. I'll follow you anywhere." But that wasn't quite right, she realized as they walked together through the town that had become home. They didn't lead or follow, they walked side by side, equal partners in the life they were building together. Later that night, in the new house they had built on the hillside overlooking their mine, Keith held her close as moonlight spilled through the bedroom window. "Happy?" he asked, his voice low in the darkness. "Beyond words," Penelope answered truthfully. "I came west expecting to bury my father and leave with nothing. Instead, I found everything I never knew I wanted." "And what about dreams?" Keith traced the line of her jaw with gentle fingers. "Do you believe in them now?" Penelope smiled, drawing him closer. "With all my heart, and I have plenty of my own now, enough for both of us." In the years that followed, Beaver grew into a proper town, as the railroad finally came through along the eastern route, just as Professor Harrison had recommended. The Norwood Young mine continued to produce, providing employment for dozens of families. Keith and Penelope expanded their business interests, investing in the growing town a new school, a proper hotel, even the territory's first lending library, where Penelope's own stories, finally written and published, held a place of honor on the shelves. And if anyone in Beaver found it unusual that a respectable mining man and his formerly Boston-bred wife could be seen each evening walking hand in hand along the ridge above town, stopping to watch the sunset with their heads close together, they were wise enough not to comment. For everyone knew the story of how Penelope Norwood had arrived in town, a weary widow who believed her life was over, and how Keith Young, with his quiet strength and unwavering belief, had shown her that dreams could be found at any age, if only one had the courage to reach for them.